The last photograph Delia Calloway took before the storm swallowed the world was of a bull elk standing at the tree line. He was enormous, motionless. His breath made small white clouds in the cold air, and he looked at her camera the way old things look at anything that doesn't belong, with patience and with pity. She got the shot. She lowered the camera, and by the time she turned back toward the truck, the sky had already changed color. That was how fast it happened. 1 hour of pale gray light, then purple deep and bruised, rolling in from the northwest like something with intention. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the time it took her to walk back across the meadow. The first flakes hit her face before she reached the tree line, soft and exploratory, the way a storm tests you before it commits. By the time she climbed back into the cab of the rented pickup, the wind had started to mean it. Rue was in the back seat with her book knees pulled to her chest, wool socks pulled to her knees, completely unbothered by the world outside the glass. She was 13 years old, and she read the way other kids played video games, obsessively hungrily, whole afternoons disappearing into the pages. She didn't look up when Delia got in. She didn't look up when Delia sat for a moment, watching the snow come down. "We should head back," Delia said. Rue, I heard you." She turned a page. "We should head back. I agree. Head back." Delia started the engine. The heater came on with a smell of old dust and burned metal. The road behind them was an unpaved logging track, 2 ruts pressed into the earth by decades of heavy machinery, cutting through second-growth forest and switchbacking down toward the main highway. In clear weather and daylight, it was a 40-minute drive. She had been on it twice before in the past week, scouting locations for a wildlife magazine, spread a commission that would pay enough to cover the next 3 months of Rue's school expenses, maybe 4 if she stretched it. The truck moved slowly on the soft ground. The snow was already beginning to fill the ruts, softening the edges of the road, making everything look gentler than it was. Delia gripped the steering wheel with both hands and leaned forward slightly, watching the tree line on either side of the track, watching the way the light fell through the snow. She heard the sound before she understood it. A wet, pressurized pop from somewhere under the hood, then a hissing rush of steam that blew back across the windshield in a white curtain, freezing instantly against the glass in a fine, opaque crust. Delia stopped the truck. She sat very still for a moment. The engine temperature gauge was already pinning hard to the right. What was that? Rue had looked up from her book. Radiator hose. Delia turned the engine off. The heater stopped immediately, and the cold pressed in against the windows like something trying to get through. We blew a radiator hose. Rue looked at the windshield, at the steam now dissipating into the snow. Then she looked at her sister. She did not panic. She was not a girl who panicked. She simply assessed the way she always did, with those dark, quiet eyes that had always seemed too old for her face. Can you fix it? Not out here, not without parts. Cell service. Delia had already pulled out her phone. She held it up. Not a single bar. She turned it in different directions, held it above the dashboard, held it against the window. Nothing. The Bitterroot backcountry had been eating cell signals since long before either of them was born. They sat in the cooling truck for 45 minutes, the windows slowly fogging from the inside, waiting for another vehicle to come down the road. None did. The logging season was winding down, the crews pulling out ahead of the weather, and this particular track served a stand of timber that had already been cleared 2 years back. Nobody had reason to come this way. The temperature outside was dropping through the 20s. Inside the metal cab with no engine heat, It was dropping faster than that. Delia had a canvas field jacket, thermal underlayer, good boots, a half bottle of water, and the remains of a granola bar. Her camera equipment, which was useless for warmth. A lighter she kept in her chest pocket, out of habit, left over from a summer she spent in Alaska, where every overnight required a fire. Rue had her down coat, her book, her wool socks. She had a packet of crackers and a bruised apple in her pack. She had a small flashlight because Rue always had a flashlight. Delia did the math the way she had been doing math her entire adult life, quickly, quietly, without showing the answer on her face. Staying in the truck meant losing heat steadily through the night. The temperature was going to fall below 0 by midnight. A metal cab with no insulation was a box. It would conduct the cold directly. Hypothermia in a metal box was not a survivable situation, not for two people dressed for an autumn afternoon. The road behind them ran back toward the highway. She had driven it for roughly 7 miles before the radiator blew, 7 miles on foot in deepening snow, in a falling temperature, in a building storm. For a fit woman alone, that was a hard walk, but a possible one. With Rue, it was different math. She looked at her sister. Rue had put down her book and was looking at her coat zipper, turning it over in her fingers. "We're walking," Delia said. Rue looked up. "How far?" "Far, but we're going to move fast, and we're going to be fine." Rue nodded once with the particular kind of seriousness that had always made Delia's chest hurt a little. She had raised this child, not perfectly, not always gracefully, but she had raised her from the age of 16 to now, after the car accident that took their mother and left the two of them alone in an apartment in Missoula with 3 months of rent prepaid and a casserole dish from the neighbor and a state social worker who came by twice before Delia convinced her that everything was under control. Rue trusted her completely, without question, and that trust was heavier than anything Delia had ever carried. They locked the truck out of instinct and started walking. The snow was already calf-deep in the open sections of the road, knee-deep, where the wind had pushed it into drifts between the trees. They walked in the ruts, what was left of them stepping high with each stride, their breath coming in quick white bursts that the wind immediately took. The cold was not a temperature, it was a presence. It moved into the gaps between her collar and her jaw, between her glove and her sleeve, found every seam and pressed through. Rue walked behind her, matching her pace, not complaining, not once. In 2 miles of hard walking through deepening snow in a Montana blizzard, Rue Calloway did not complain. She stumbled once, went down on one knee, was up before Delia could turn around. She kept moving. The road disappeared. Delia didn't notice it happening. The snow had been filling the ruts, gradually smoothing them, and she had been following them by slight visual reference, by the gap in the trees, by the feel of packed earth under the snow. And then, at some point, those references had all gone away, and she was walking through unbroken white with trees on both sides, and she wasn't sure anymore where the road was, whether she was still on it, whether she had drifted into the forest without realizing it. She stopped. Behind her, Rue almost walked into her back. "Delia." "I know." She turned in a slow circle. The trees looked the same in every direction. The wind had picked up sharply in the last 20 minutes, driving the snow nearly horizontal now, and visibility had dropped to 30 yards, maybe less. The light was wrong. Everything was gray and white and without shadow, the kind of light that removes depth and distance and makes the world two-dimensional and featureless. "I know. Just give me a second." Her fingers had stopped hurting, and started to simply feel absent, which was worse. The lighter in her chest pocket was a fact she kept returning to, kept pressing against mentally, the way you press your tongue against a loose tooth. Fire. She needed fire. She needed walls. She needed to stop moving and get warm, or the moving would stop on its own. The mind does a thing in extreme cold. It gets quiet in a way that feels like calm, but isn't. It suggests rest. It frames stopping as reasonable as earned. Her legs felt like columns of concrete. Her heart was working too hard, and her breathing was too shallow, and somewhere between the 2 miles and the 3 miles mark, a soft, warm, persuasive voice had started suggesting that sitting down for just a moment wasn't the worst idea she'd ever had. She recognized it. She had read enough about hypothermia, had spent enough time in wild country, in cold weather, to recognize what that voice was and what it meant. She had stopped walking. She made herself start again. Rue's hand found hers, small fingers locking around her palm, and they walked together through the blowing white. Delia, watching the tree line, watching for anything that wasn't trees, wasn't snow, wasn't the flat gray nothingness of the storm. She went down hard. Her boot caught something buried under the snow, a root, a rock, a ridge of earth, and she went face first into a drift, sinking into it up to her elbows, the cold sealing around her face like a mask. She lay there for a moment, and the snow was very quiet under her. The wind muffled, and she thought, I could stay here, just for a moment, just until the cold stopped. She turned her head. The wind shifted. In the gap between one gust and the next, the curtain of blowing snow thinned for 3 seconds, maybe 4, a brief clarification of the world, a small window through the white, and in that window 50 yards to her left, something broke the flat line of the forest, a vertical shape, sharp edge, too straight for a tree, too deliberate for rock. It rose above the canopy line and caught what pale light there was from the hidden sky, and it was the color of wet stone, dark gray, almost black, and it was clearly, unmistakably made by human hands. A chimney. Delia pushed herself upright. She got her knees under her, then her feet. She grabbed Rue's arm. There, she pointed. Do you see it? The wind had closed the curtain again, white and impenetrable, but Rue had seen it in the same window. She was already nodding, already turning. They moved toward it. The slope dropped away to the left of the road in a long, shallow decline, and as they moved through the trees, the ground became irregular, broken, not the smooth forest floor, but something shaped by geology, by old violence in the rock. The snow hid everything, but she could feel the change under her boots. Then the trees opened slightly, and she saw what was below. The hinge of the land here was a geological formation that looked from above like a frozen moment, a natural arch of basalt dark and ancient, spanning a ravine that dropped 40 feet to nothing but shadow and ice. The arch was not thin. It was wide as a room, maybe 8 feet across at its narrowest. The stone, dark gray and veined with mineral threads, covered on its upper surface by a thin shell of ice that had built up over years of freeze and melt and freeze again. Below it, the ravine was a black seam in the white world, perfectly silent, perfectly still, and sitting on top of the arch, resting directly on the stone like something that had been set there by a hand that didn't account for what would happen over a century, was a building, a ranger station, old enough that the logs had turned nearly black with age and moisture and decades of weather, old enough that the roof had partially collapsed on the eastern side, the timbers sagging inward, snow-loaded and dark, old enough that the whole structure had settled, the years pushing it off plumb so that it sat on the arch, at a tilt, leaning eastward, at an angle that should have made it fall years ago, but hadn't held upright by the simple stubbornness of its own construction and by one feature that remained absolutely, perfectly vertical, even as everything around it tilted and sagged and gave way to time. The chimney. It rose from the center of the structure like a spine, built from riverstone rounded gray and brown and tan stones fitted together with an expertise that had outlasted the men who built it by at least 100 years. It was massive, wider at the base than a grown man's arm span, and it rose straight and true and undamaged above the collapse and tilted wreck of the cabin around it, emerging above the roofline by a full 6 feet, stained with decades of smoke and weather and lichen, solid as the basalt arch it sat upon. Delia stared at it. The cold was still there. The wind was still there. Her hands were still gone beyond sensation. But for a moment she simply stared at this thing, this impossible ancient sideways station sitting on a stone arch above a frozen canyon, its chimney pointing at the sky like an act of defiance, and felt something that wasn't warmth but was adjacent to it. Then she saw the access. There was no path down, not a built one, but along the left wall of the ravine where the rock face dropped to the arch, there was a ledge, a natural shelf in the basalt, roughly 18 inches wide, running for perhaps 60 yards along the face of the cliff at the level of the arch. It was not a trail. It was an accident of geology that happened to connect the forest floor to the arch surface. It was also covered in ice and offered nothing to hold on to, no railing, no rope line, no carved handholds, just rock and ice and a 40-foot drop on the right side. There was no other way down. Delia looked at Rue. Rue looked at the ledge, then at the chimney, then at her sister. "Okay," Rue said quietly, that single word containing all her 13-year-old stoicism, all the compression of fear into something functional, into something that could be used. "Stay right behind me, one hand on the wall. Don't look down." I wasn't going to look down. Good. Delia went first. She found the ledge. With her boot tested it. The ice gave slightly under pressure, but the rock beneath was solid. She pressed her left palm flat against the cliff face and began to move. Slowly, weight shifting, first testing each step before committing to it. The wind came in from the right side off the open ravine, and it was rawer here, sharper, nothing to break it. It pushed at her shoulder. It pushed at her back. She pressed herself closer to the rock face and kept moving. 15 yards, 20. The stone was wet under her palm, faintly textured, and she focused on the texture, the small ridges and pits in the basalt, keeping her eyes on the wall and her feet on the ledge. Don't look at the drop. Don't look at the station. Don't look anywhere but this 12 inches of rock directly in front of your hand. She was 30 yards along when her left boot hit a patch of ice that was smoother than the rest, a place where melt water had pooled and refrozen into a glassy shell, and her foot slid outward off the ledge. For 1 second she was falling. Her right hand slapped the rock face, and her fingers found a crack in the basalt, a narrow seam, and she drove her fingers into it and stopped herself. Her left foot swung out into open air above the ravine, and she was pressed against the cliff face with her cheek against the stone, and her heart hammering so hard it shook her vision. Behind her, Rue had frozen in place. Delia pulled her foot back onto the ledge. She found solid ice tested. It shifted her weight. She breathed once. She kept moving. She made it across. She turned on the arch surface, reached back, and guided Rue through the last 10 feet, her hand on her sister's arm, steady, firm, not pulling, just present until Rue stepped off the ledge onto the arch, and they were both standing on the basalt, 8 feet of ancient stone between them and the ravine below. The station was directly ahead. Up close, it was smaller than it had seemed from above and more damaged. The western wall had held. The roof over the western two-thirds was intact, heavy with snow, but structurally present. The eastern section had given way at some point years ago, judging by the weathering on the broken timbers, and the collapse had pushed the whole structure into its current lean. The door on the front face was barely recognizable as a door. The wood had swollen and warped with decades of moisture cycling, and the iron hardware was a single block of rust. There was no opening it by normal means. The window to the right of the door was still partially intact. The frame had held, though 2 of the 3 glass panes had cracked, and the bottom one had fallen in at some point, leaving a jagged opening roughly the size of a piece of luggage. Delia picked up a piece of timber from the collapsed eastern eave, loose and punky with rot, and knocked the remaining glass fragments out of the lower pane. She wrapped her hand in the tail of her jacket, checked the sill for teeth, and climbed through. She landed on the floor and her boot went through immediately. The floorboards inside were not uniformly rotten. The western section under the intact roof had stayed drier and held, but the floor near the entrance had suffered, and the board she landed on split beneath her weight, her boot punching through into cold air and shadow below. She caught herself on the windowsill, pulled her foot back, tested the adjacent board with careful pressure before stepping on it. The floor was navigable if you were careful, if you paid attention. The rotten sections were darker, slightly softer looking, even in the dim light, and she learned quickly to avoid them. She helped Rue through the window. They stood in the dim interior of the station and simply breathed for a moment. The wind was gone. That was the first thing. The howling physical weight of the wind outside, pressing against you, filling your ears, making thought difficult. It stopped at the walls. Inside was not warm. The ambient temperature was still well below freezing. She estimated somewhere in the upper teens, but the stillness was immediate and profound, and felt after the last hour of fighting through the storm like something close to peace. The smell hit her second. Dry rot, pine resin, the deep mineral scent of old stone, and beneath it something else, a metallic stillness, the smell of air that had not moved in a very long time, the olfactory equivalent of a room holding its breath. Delia held up Rue's flashlight and swept it around. The station had been someone's workplace once. Someone who had spent real time in it had made it functional, if not comfortable. There was a work table along the north wall, heavy, hand-built, still more or less level, despite the tilt of the floor around it. A logbook of some kind sat on it, swollen with moisture, its cover welded to the first pages by decades of humidity and cold. A pair of canvas straps hung on a nail near the door, the kind used for snowshoes. 2 wooden chairs, one on its side against the east wall, one still upright in the lean of the room's tilt, braced against the table leg. Against the south wall, a wooden cabinet with a rusted tin latch, closed, and spanning the entire center section of the west wall, anchored directly into the stone of the arch below its foundation, deeper than the building that surrounded it, the fireplace. Delia stood in front of it and understood immediately why it was the only thing in the room that hadn't moved, hadn't settled, hadn't tilted with the rest of the structure. It wasn't part of the structure. It was older than the structure. The arch had been here first, the basalt formation running its ancient course through the mountain, and someone had built the the fireplace, into the arch itself, setting stones into the natural formation, following its contours, working with the geology rather than against it. The result was a fireplace that was effectively part of the mountain. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't tilting with anything. It simply was. The mouth of the fireplace was wide enough for Delia to stand in it with her arms at her sides. The stones were fitted with a precision that spoke of real craft, rounded river stones of various sizes, set without mortar in some places, mortared in others, with a material that had hardened to the consistency of the stone itself over decades. The interior of the box was black, with old soot layered and resinous built up over years of winter fires into a crust that had turned almost geological in its own right. Cold air breathed faintly from the chimney throat above. She needed wood. She took the chair that was still upright and simply tipped it forward onto the floor, then stomped down on the seat hard once with the heel of her boot. The wood split cleanly. It was old and dried and wanted to come apart, and she broke the seat and the legs and the back into pieces small enough to burn. She found a sheaf of papers in the cabinet against the south wall, forms of some kind official looking, the ink gone brown and unreadable, and rolled them into tubes. She knelt at the hearth with the lighter. The rolled paper caught on the first spark. She fed the chair pieces in gradually small pieces first, then larger, watching the fire build. It was beginning to throw real heat when the smoke hit her. It didn't go up. It boiled outward from the fireplace mouth, acrid and gray, and immediately filling the room from the ceiling down. Rue coughed, stepped back. Delia pressed the back of her hand over her nose and tried to peer up into the chimney throat. The damper, she could see the iron plate of it from below, a flat rectangle of metal blocking the flue, fused in the closed position by rust and time. If she couldn't open it, the fire had to go out, or the smoke would kill them faster than the cold. She grabbed the poker she'd found, leaning against the cabinet, a thin iron rod, the end bent into a hook, and thrust it up into the chimney. She felt it scrape against the underside of the damper plate. She pushed upward, trying to lever it open. The iron flexed, but the plate didn't move. Rusted into the frame, completely seized, she dropped the poker and wrapped her jacket sleeve around her hand. She thrust her arm into the chimney throat. The cold air fell around her forearm. The soot was thick and waxy against her sleeve. She reached for the edge of the damper plate, with her fingers feeling for the mounting bracket, for the pivot point, for anything that suggested where the mechanism was and how to force it. The soot rained down on her face. She turned her head and kept feeling. Her fingers found the edge of the plate. She traced it to the right, feeling for the lever arm, the small iron rod that would be connected to the plate on one side and exposed to the flue on the other. The mechanism should be there, should be within reach. She stretched further her shoulder now inside the firebox opening. Her fingertips passed the edge of the plate and found nothing. She moved them further, right past where the lever arm should have been, past the stone of the flue wall, and there her fingers caught on something that absolutely should not have been there. It was fabric, heavy, tightly woven, stiff with age, canvas or something like it. She pressed her fingers against it and felt a loop strap, a handle, clearly a handle riveted at both ends, set into a gap in the stone ledge behind the damper plate. She pressed further. The object behind the strap was solid, dense, metal, she thought, a container of some kind, rectangular, sitting on a narrow ledge in the masonry behind the damper plate, deliberately hidden in the one place that even a thorough searcher might not think to look, because you would have to know the damper was frozen, and you would have to have reason to reach past it into the cold flue beyond. Delia withdrew her arm from the chimney. She stood up covered in soot, coughing, and she looked at the fire still fighting for its life in the hearth below the sealed damper, and then she looked at Rue. "There's something in the chimney," she said. Rue stopped coughing. "What? I don't know yet." She reached back in. She got both hands around the canvas strap and she pulled. The object didn't move. It was heavy, genuinely heavy, heavy enough that it had settled into the ledge over decades, and the stone above had partially compressed the wrapping, and the narrow angle of the flue gave her no leverage. She braced her boots against the lower edge of the firebox, pressed her back against the mantel stone, and pulled with everything she had left. The scrape of metal against stone was like a cry. Then the release, sudden and total, and the object came free of the ledge and dropped. It hit the iron grate with a ringing impact that shook the hearthstone. It bounced off the grate and landed directly on the fire, a heavy, rectangular mass that immediately smothered the flames beneath it, scattering sparks and sending a fresh wave of smoke billowing out into the room. Delia grabbed the poker and worked quickly, rolling the object off the fire before the wrapping could fully ignite. It was heavier than it looked, and it took real effort to get it clear of the firebox and onto the hearthstone. She kicked it away from the coals. The smoke began to thin slowly as the fire beneath died back to coals, and the slight draft from the broken window carried some of it out. On the hearthstone, the object smoked faintly. It was wrapped in a heavy cloth. She recognized the material, now the dense, faintly metallic weave of asbestos fabric, the kind used for insulation in the mid-20th century, common in any era when fire resistance mattered more than health. The outside of the cloth was blackened and charred, almost completely carbonized in places, but it had done its job. Inside, behind that sacrificial shell of burned cloth, whatever it was protecting had survived. She peeled the cloth away in pieces, the charred material crumbling at the edges. Underneath was a steel box, roughly the size of a large hardcover book, maybe 3 inches deep. The steel was pitted with surface rust, but structurally intact, the seams still closed, the latch still engaged. A heavy brass padlock held the latch shut, the brass gone green with oxidation. Delia sat back on her heels and looked at it. Beside her, Rue had come close. She crouched next to her sister, looking at the box in the fading firelight, her dark eyes moving over it with that careful attention she gave to anything she didn't yet understand. "Who puts a lockbox in a chimney?" Rue said. "Someone who needs to hide something," Delia said, "and can't go back for it." She went to the cabinet and found the small tool roll she'd noticed earlier, wrapped in the same oilcloth that mechanics had used since the beginning of mechanics, tied with a leather thong. Inside, a rusted hammer, a pair of pliers, and a short pry bar, thick iron, the curve of it worn to a shine on the inside edge from use. She wedged the curved end of the pry bar into the loop of the padlock, pressed it against the hasp, and threw her weight against the handle. The brass fought her. It was old, but it was still brass, still a material of some inherent stubbornness. She felt it flex. She repositioned and pressed again harder, driving her weight through her arms into the bar. The padlock sheared at the shackle with a sharp, small sound, a ping almost delicate, followed by the clatter of the broken hardware on the hearthstone. Delia set down the pry bar. She opened the box. The hinges screamed. The smell came first: old paper and dried leather and closed air, the smell of a space that had been sealed so long it had its own atmosphere. She held the lighter over the open lid. The box was packed with a precision that suggested someone who had thought about this, who had arranged these contents with deliberate intention. On top, currency, bundled with rubber bands that had dried to nothing over the decades, the bands crumbling to powder when she touched them, the bills fanning out loosely. She picked one up and held it near the flame. $100 bill, large format, older style, the printing slightly different from anything in circulation now, but most noticeably the seal, not green, red, a bright, crisp red seal on old paper, a United States note rather than a Federal Reserve note, the kind of currency that had stopped being issued before most people living now were born. She had come across them before in the prop departments of the film projects she'd scouted for. The prop masters always said the same thing: pre-1966 red seal notes were worth considerably more than their face value to the right collector. Considerably more. She counted the first bundle, $10,000, flipped it to see the next bundle underneath. 5 more stacked neatly. $60,000 in vintage currency that had been sitting in this chimney since the age of Lyndon Johnson. She set the money aside. Below it, gold, not coins, bars, 4 of them each roughly the size and shape of a modern cell phone, heavy and dull, yellow, the surfaces stamped with serial numbers and an assayer's mark. She lifted one, felt the real weight of it, the particular density that only gold has, heavier than it looks, always heavier than it looks. 4 bars. She estimated somewhere between 15 and 20 troy ounces each. She did the rough calculation in her head and stopped when the number became something she couldn't process in a cold room in Montana. She set the bars aside. At the bottom of the box, a small journal bound in dark leather, the cover faintly stamped with initials, EHP, and beside it a thick envelope of heavy stock paper sealed with red wax. The wax had hardened and dried over decades into something like stone, cracked at the edges, but still holding its seal. On the front of the envelope in dark blue ink, a hand that had been careful and deliberate and was still 50-some years later, clear and legible, 3 words written in a slanted cursive that spoke of a person who had been taught penmanship in a time when it mattered. For Beatrice Calloway. Delia read it twice. She read it a 3rd time. Beside her, Rue had leaned in to see. She was very close, her shoulder touching Delia's, and Delia felt her sister go still in the way she went still when she was processing something that didn't make sense yet. Calloway, Rue said quietly, a statement, not a question. They both heard what the word meant. Calloway was not a common name. It was not a Smith or a Jones or a Williams. It was specific, regional, a name their mother had traced back 4 generations to a family of cattle ranchers in the Mountain West, a lineage Delia had never paid much attention to because the living members of it were only her and Rue, and it hadn't seemed to require much investigation. Their mother was Margaret Calloway, born 1970 in Spokane, Washington, to a woman named Beatrice, who had, as their mother had always put it, with a flatness that foreclosed further questions, disappeared before Margaret was old enough to remember her face. Delia broke the wax seal. She did it carefully, working at the edges with her thumbnail, preserving what she could of the paper. The envelope contained several sheets folded together, the paper aged to the color of old ivory, spotted faintly with moisture, staining but intact, the ink still readable if she held it close to the lighter's flame. She unfolded the first sheet. December 4th, 1968. My dearest Beatrice, if you are reading this, it means I did not make it to Spokane. It means the night in these mountains went the way I feared it might go when I started running. I want you to know that I am not afraid. I am cold, yes. I have been cold for 2 days, but when I think about you, about the way you laugh, when something surprises you, about your hands, about the specific way you say my name, I feel something that is not cold. I want you to know that. I need to tell you the truth about the inheritance, about your family's land, about what was done to it and by whom, and what I did about it. Your father worked that ranch for 30 years. He paid his taxes. He registered his deed. The deed is dated 1961, recorded with the county clerk in his name, Harlan Callaway, 340 acres, Bitterroot Valley, Montana. It should have been yours after he passed. It should have gone into your name without complication, without question. What happened instead was Raymond Colton. You know his name. You know his face. Deputy Sheriff Raymond Colton, who was at your father's funeral and shook your hand and told you he was sorry for your loss. What he did not tell you was that he had already begun the process of erasing your family's claim to that land. The foreclosure filing he submitted to the county 3 months after your father died was a forgery. I can prove this because I found the original deed and the forged documents both in the same place in the private safe in Colton's office at the county sheriff's station, where he apparently kept his records with the confidence of a man who believed no one would ever look. I looked. I broke the lock on that safe 2 nights ago, and I looked at every document in it. What I found was a record of systematic theft extending over more than a decade, carried out against families who had no recourse and no champion. Your family's land was one case among many, but it was the one that started this. It was the one that made me understand what was happening in this county and who was responsible. I took the documents. I took the journal he kept of his transactions, dates, amounts, names of the officials he paid to look away. I took the deed to your father's land, and because I knew he would not let this stand, because I knew what men like Raymond Colton do to people who take what they have decided belongs to them, I took the money from the safe as well, the gold, the cash. I did not do this for personal gain. I did it because it is the only language such men understand, and because the money finances what comes next. I have been in these mountains for 2 days. The snow is covering my tracks, but I can hear dogs in the distance sometimes when the wind shifts. He has resources. He has loyal men. I know what he is capable of. I found a ranger station on a stone arch above a canyon near the upper ridge. I am writing this by firelight. I am going to put this box in the chimney. There is a ledge above the damper plate, and I can fit the box on it with the ledge on either side. I am going to go out into this storm and try to find the highway. If I make it, I will come to you, and we will take this to the FBI in Seattle, and we will be done with Montana and Raymond Colton together. We will go to Canada like we talked about. We will start somewhere that this man's reach does not extend. If I do not make it, if you are reading this without me there to read it with you, then I need you to listen to what I am about to say. Do not take this to the local authorities. Do not take it to the county sheriff. Do not take it to anyone in this county who carries a badge or holds elected office, because Raymond Colton's network reaches into every office in this valley, and you will not be able to distinguish his people from honest ones. Take the box, take the journal, take the deed, Get on the highway and drive to Seattle. Go directly to the FBI field office. Tell them you have documentation of systematic corruption, land fraud, and obstruction of justice spanning more than a decade, and that the primary responsible party is Deputy Sheriff Raymond Colton of Bitterroot County, Montana. They will listen. The evidence is irrefutable. He kept perfect records of his own crimes. The deed to your father's ranch is in this box beneath the money. Keep it. It belongs to your family. I love you with everything I am. I have loved you since the first time I heard you argue about something you cared about, which was within the first hour of knowing you. I love the way you fight for things. I love that you gave me a reason to fight for something too. I am so cold, Beatrice, but I think of you and I am warm. Forever yours, Elias. Delia lowered the letter. The fire had died back to coals while she read. The room was darker now, lit mostly by the orange glow from the hearth, and outside the wind had not stopped, had not quieted, but it seemed very far away from where she was kneeling on the hearthstone of a fireplace in a tilting station above a frozen canyon with a 55-year-old letter in her soot-stained hands. Beatrice Calloway, her grandmother, the woman her mother had described, on the rare occasion she described her at all, with a kind of careful blankness, the way you describe a room that's been locked for so long you've almost forgotten what it contains. She disappeared, her mother had said, before I was old enough to know her face. I don't know where she went. I don't know why. Nobody could tell me, and after a while I stopped asking. Delia had never thought to ask either. She had been 16 when her mother died, and she had been occupied with the immediate arithmetic of survival keeping. The apartment keeping Rue, keeping herself together well enough to be what Rue needed, and the question of a grandmother who had vanished before her mother's second birthday had not seemed urgent or relevant. Now it seemed like the only thing. Elias Pendleton had hidden this box in December of 1968. He had hidden it for a woman named Beatrice Calloway, who was Delia's grandmother, which meant Elias Pendleton had known Beatrice Calloway, had loved her enough to write that letter, by firelight in a blizzard, while dogs bayed in the distance, and had never made it to Spokane. He had never made it to Spokane, which meant Beatrice had never received the letter, had never known the truth about her father's land, had never known what Elias had found in Colton's safe or why he had run or what he had done to try to protect what was hers. She had simply waited and he had not come, and at some point alone, without answers, without recourse, she had disappeared. Delia became aware that Rue was very close, had moved close at some point during the reading, had positioned herself so she could see the letter but not quite read it in the firelight, and was now sitting with her shoulder against her sister's shoulder, waiting. He knew her, Rue said. Grandma Beatrice. He knew her. Yes, and the land, the 340 acres. It was her family's. Delia folded the letter with careful hands. It was stolen. Rue was quiet for a moment, processing the way she processed things, not impulsively but thoroughly, working through the implications in order. Then Raymond Colton. Yes, is that Colton Timber and Mining? Delia said it without inflection. She had seen the signs on this drive-in, on every drive into this part of the backcountry for the past week. The name was on the access gates, on the boundary markers, on the company trucks that had passed her on the main highway with their loads of timber and their branding in blue and green. She had not known it then. She knew it now. Yes, that's the same family. She was about to say more. She was about to say that she'd read something in the Missoula paper last month about the Colton family, about the son, about an election when Rue's hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, just firmly. The way Rue communicated urgency without sound. Delia looked at her sister. Rue was looking at the window, the broken window through which they had entered, its empty pane, now open to the storm. Through it, a light moved across the snow, yellow-white swinging slightly, the moving beam of a headlight. The sound behind it came a fraction of a second later, partially masked by the wind, but unmistakably mechanical, unmistakably deliberate. An engine, coming closer, stopping. Delia did not move. She did not reach for the box. She did not look at it. She kept her eyes on the window and her body still, the way she went, still in the field, when something large was close, and she needed it not to know she was there. Beside her, Rue had gone, equally motionless, her breath coming in slow, controlled intervals, her hand still on her sister's wrist. The headlight beam swept across the window opening again, steady now, not moving, parked. The engine cut. Silence pressed in around the wind. Then boots. On stone, not on wood, whoever it was, had found the arched surface and was crossing it, moving toward the station with the confidence of someone who knew where they were going. The footsteps were heavy and even and unhurried, which was the worst kind. Panic runs, urgency rushes. Whatever was coming toward this door was doing neither. Delia's eyes moved around the room. One entrance, the door still swollen shut in its frame. One exit, the window they'd come through. The window was behind the approaching person, not an option. The collapsed east section of the station had an opening where the roof had come down, but the floor in that direction was almost entirely gone, punched through by years of weather loading and rot, and she could not get Rue across it in the dark without someone going through. She looked at the box on the hearthstone. She looked at the lockbox, the money, the gold bars, the journal, the letter in her hand. She made a decision. She folded the letter back into the envelope and pressed it into the inside pocket of her field jacket against her chest. Then she gathered the money bundles and the gold bars and the leather journal and put them back in the box, working fast and without sound, and latched the lid. She picked up the broken padlock from the hearthstone and looked at it, no way to reattach it. The shackle was sheared through. She set it down. The hearthstone, the asbestos cloth charred and crumbling, sitting in plain view beside the coals. She couldn't hide that. She picked up the pry bar and held it at her side. The door handle rattled, once hard testing, finding the wood swollen and immovable. A pause of perhaps 3 seconds, then a boot connected with the door just below the latch. A single controlled impact, and the frame splintered inward, and the door swung open, and the blizzard came through in a rush of cold and light. The figure in the doorway was large, not unusually tall, but broadly built, the kind of build that comes from physical work sustained over decades rather than from a gym. He wore a heavy canvas and wool coat, the kind rated for serious cold, and insulated pants and boots that had seen real backcountry use. A balaclava covered everything below his eyes, snow goggles pushed up on his forehead, a headlamp on a band around his head, currently throwing its beam across the interior of the station and moving slowly, methodically across the walls, the work table, the cabinet, the hearth. Over his right shoulder slung barrel down in the casual carry of a man accustomed to firearms, a bolt-action rifle. He stepped inside and used his heel to push the broken door back against its frame, reducing the wind. He pulled the balaclava down and the goggles off and set both in his coat pocket. The face underneath was weathered and square-jawed, the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and showed every one of them. His eyes were pale brown and completely calm, and they moved around the room with a professional assessment that was more unsettling than anger would have been. He looked at the two of them, at Delia with the pry bar, at Rue beside her, at the fire in the hearth burning on almost nothing, now just the remnant heat of coals, at the work table, at the open cabinet. Then his eyes moved to the hearthstone and found what she had not been able to hide, the asbestos cloth, charred and blackened, sitting on the stone in pieces. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Delia. He unslung the rifle and held it in both hands at a downward angle, not aimed, but present the way a person holds a tool they are comfortable with and intend to use if needed. "Hell of a night to be up here," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, with the particular flatness of a man who has learned to remove tone from his speech as a professional habit. "Saw the smoke from the ridge. You're lucky I was running perimeter." "Our truck broke down," Delia said. She kept her voice steady. "A few miles up the logging road. We walked in looking for shelter. We didn't know this was private property." He nodded as if this was a reasonable explanation that he was choosing to set aside for the moment. "Wade Briggs," he said, "head of security, Colton Timber and Mining. This whole valley falls under company land. Every acre of it." He paused. "You broke in. The window was already partially open. We needed shelter. We'll pay for the damage." He wasn't listening. His eyes had moved back to the hearthstone, to the asbestos cloth, to the snap padlock lying beside the coals, completely free of dust, the brass bright at the break point in a way that only new metal is bright. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked back at her, the flatness in his face had changed, not to anger, to something more controlled than anger, which was attention, absolute focused attention, the kind that narrows a person down to a single point. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. "I don't know what you mean." He moved his eyes to the hearthstone again, back to her. "The cloth is asbestos wrap, late 50s, early 60s manufacture most likely. You don't find that in a chimney by accident. You find it because something was stored in that chimney that needed fire protection." He tilted his head very slightly. "What did you take out of there?" "We needed to open the damper. The smoke was filling the room. I reached up and—" "Where's the box, Miss Calloway?" The name hit her like cold water. She did not react. She was careful not to react because reacting to hearing your name from a stranger who should not know it would tell him everything he needed to know about what she was thinking. She kept her face still and her eyes on his and said nothing. He watched her not react, and she could see from the slight change in his expression that her stillness told him what he needed to know anyway. "The Colton family has been looking for that box for a long time," he said. He had shifted his weight slightly, redistributing it the way a person does when they are settling in for something. Raymond Colton spent the last 15 years of his life sending crews into these mountains, trying to find where Elias Pendleton hid what he took. Pendleton was careful. He was smart for a kid who was running scared in a blizzard with dogs behind him. Took Raymond the better part of a decade to even identify this arch as a likely location. He paused. Raymond died before he could finish the job. He let that sit. "Garrett Colton is running for governor," he continued. "Election is 8 days away. His campaign is built on this county's economy, timber, mining, land management. all of it rooted in assets the family has held since the 1960s. If the documents Pendleton took from Raymond's safe were to surface now at this particular moment, he stopped. The implication was sufficient. Garrett Colton needs that box found and emptied before Election Day. He has needed it for 2 years. He's needed it urgently for the last 8 days. Delia was aware of Rue beside her, aware of her sister's breathing slow and deliberate the way she breathed when she was controlling fear. She didn't look at her. "We don't have anything," Delia said. Briggs looked at the box on the hearthstone. She had not moved it. It was sitting directly in front of the fire, in plain sight, because there had been no time and no reasonable location to put it that he wouldn't immediately find. She had made the calculation that hiding it poorly was worse than having it visible, that a man like this would find it in 30 seconds of looking regardless. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I'm going to need you to step away from the hearth," he said. She did not step away. "Here's what I'm offering," Briggs said, and his voice had taken on the particular quality of a professional making a professional statement clear and specific. "You hand me the box, everything in it undisturbed. I call for transport and get both of you out of these mountains tonight. Warm vehicle highway access within the hour, no charges for trespass or breaking entry. You walk away. You go back to wherever you came from. You don't talk about what you found here because you have no proof you found anything, and I have no reason to complicate your lives if you have no reason to complicate ours." He let a beat pass. "That's the offer. It's the only one I'm making." Delia looked at him, at the rifle, at his hands on the rifle, not tense, not gripping hard, but present. She did the calculation the way she had done every calculation in her adult life quickly, without the luxury of being wrong. He had told her 2 things without meaning to. He had told her Garrett Colton needed the box before the election, which meant the box's contents were dangerous to Colton in a specific and immediate way, and he had called her by her last name without being introduced, which meant he had known who she was before he walked through that door. Both of those things meant the offer he was making was not a real offer. A man who needed something badly enough to send a security team into a blizzard on a Tuesday night in November did not give it back to a potential witness and ask her politely not to mention it. Not when the something in question was documentation of crimes that could take down a gubernatorial campaign. Not when the witness had read the letter in the box, which he didn't know yet, but would figure out the moment he opened it and found the wax seal broken. Hand over the box, and she became a liability. She became a liability the moment she stepped off this arch. She breathed once slowly. "I'll need to pick it up," she said. "The box. It's heavy. I'll need both hands." He watched her. "Go ahead." She crouched toward the box, the pry bar still in her right hand, hanging at her side. She put her left hand on the box lid as if preparing to lift it. She kept her eyes down on the box, which meant he was watching her hands and not her face, and he could not see what she was doing with her expression. She looked at Rue. Rue was looking at the work table behind Briggs. On the table, the swollen logbook, a tin cup, and the leather journal from the box that she had, without Delia noticing, quietly set on the table's edge during the conversation. Rue's eyes moved from the journal to Briggs' back to Delia, a question that required no words. Delia answered it with the smallest possible nod. She came up fast, driving upward from her crouch, and swung the pry bar in a tight arc from her right side, not at him, not at his body, but at the rifle barrel connecting with the underside of it at full speed. driving the muzzle upward and to the left. The impact rang up her arm to her shoulder. The rifle jerked violently vertical, the barrel pointing at the ceiling, and his finger contracted on the trigger by reflex. The sound in the small stone room was enormous, a pressure event, not just a noise. The blast compressed the air, and Delia felt it against her face as much as heard it. The round went through the ceiling directly above them and punched a ragged hole through the rotting timber and out into the snow above, and snow and splinters rained down in a brief shower. Before the echo finished, Rue threw the journal. She threw it hard and accurately, the way she threw everything, with complete commitment to the task, and it connected with the side of Briggs's face at the ear corner. First, the thick leather cover, making solid contact. He flinched sideways, his hands going to his face. For one involuntary second, the rifle dipping. 1 second was enough. Delia drove her right boot into the outside of his left knee with everything she had. She felt the joint flex the wrong direction, felt the resistance, and then the give, and Briggs went down on that side with a sound that was both vocal and involuntary. Not a shout, more like a release of pressure, the sound a person makes when their body overrides their intention. He went down hard, taking the camp table with him, the tin cup and the logbook hitting the floor. She grabbed the box. She grabbed Rue's arm. The door was broken in its frame, and it opened with a single shove, and they were out on the arch surface, in the full force of the storm, the cold slamming into them like a wall. After the relative shelter of the station interior, the wind driving needles of ice horizontally into any exposed skin. Briggs's snowmobile was parked at the far end of the arch, where the basalt surface met the slope of the mountain. It was a large machine, a working vehicle rather than a recreational one, dull green with a cargo rack on the back. The engine was still warm. The key was in the ignition. She heard him behind them, in the station, recovering the scrape of the table being pushed aside and the impact of his weight shifting on the floor. Then, muffled by the walls but unmistakable, the bolt being worked on the rifle. Delia shoved the box onto the cargo rack and grabbed the bungee cord, already there, a piece of equipment left for exactly this kind of use, and ran it over the box, once hooking it. Not secure, not ideal, good enough for the next 60 seconds. She swung onto the machine, the seat cold through her pants. Rue climbed on behind her without being told, her arms going around Delia's waist, locking. Delia found the throttle and the brake and turned the key. The engine caught immediately. A bullet hit the stone of the arch 6 feet to her left, and the sound of the shot reached her a half-second later. Briggs, now standing in the broken doorway of the station with his rifle, one hand on the frame for support, his left leg clearly unwilling to bear full weight. She opened the throttle. The track bit into the arch surface and then onto the slope, and they were moving faster than was safe, faster than was sensible, the headlight cutting a single bright cone through the blowing white and revealing the terrain at a range of about 30 feet, which was exactly 30 feet less than she needed at this speed. She steered by the shapes emerging from the dark tree trunks, materializing from white into black, and then past them, the fall line of the slope, her primary guide, gravity and momentum doing the work, while she managed direction with small adjustments of the handlebars. The wind in her face was brutal. She could not see. She could barely breathe against the force of the air, and her hands were already past the point of full sensation on the grips, and she leaned forward over the machine and trusted the slope. Behind her, Rue's arms were a fixed point of pressure around her waist, present, constant, not tightening in panic, not loosening in exhaustion, simply there like a fact of physics, like something that was not going to change. She did not know how long they descended. Time in extreme cold and extreme darkness becomes unreliable, compressed in some moments and dilated in others. She felt the gradient of the slope ease, felt the density of the trees change, felt the quality of the terrain shift from mountain to foothills beneath the machine's track. The wind lost its rawness, gradually losing the high-altitude edge that makes mountain cold different from any other kind. The trees parted. 2 lanes of asphalt blown nearly clear by the wind, with the white lines barely visible between lanes of compressed snow. A road. Beyond it, on the far shoulder, the running lights of a vehicle. A large vehicle pulled to the side with hazards blinking. Interstate 90. She brought the snowmobile to a stop on the road's edge and sat for a moment, the engine idling, the headlight pointing into the dark of the highway. Rue loosened her arms and sat up. They looked at the road. Neither of them said anything. Then Rue climbed off the machine and Delia followed, and they walked across the highway toward the truck with its hazard lights, and a man in a heavy coat opened the passenger door from the inside and looked at them the way people look at things that appear out of blizzards in the middle of the night, with a combination of alarm and relief, and the particular discomfort of encountering something you're not sure is real. He was a long-haul driver, mid-50s, coffee in a thermos on the dash, a CB radio, crackling with weather reports. He took them in Delia, covered in soot, with a pry bar in her hand, Rue, with dried tears on her face from the wind, and said the thing that people say when they don't know what else to say. "You two all right? We need to get to the next truck stop," Delia said. "We need to call someone." He nodded. He did not ask any further questions. He was the kind of man who understood that there were situations in which further questions were not the right response, and this was clearly one of them. He moved his jacket from the passenger seat, and they climbed in Rue, in the middle Delia, against the door, the heat from the cab's vents hitting them immediately and making the thaw begin the agonizing return of sensation to hands and face the pins and needles that meant the circulation was coming back. The driver pulled back onto the highway. He handed Delia the thermos without comment. She opened it and passed it to Rue first. Rue drank and passed it back. They drove in silence for a while. The truck's engine was loud and steady, and the heater was working hard, and the highway stretched out ahead of them in the headlights, the asphalt mostly clear. In the lanes, the shoulders drifted deep. The storm was still going, but from inside the cab, it was a different thing, a spectacle rather than an immediate fact, something happening outside the glass rather than directly against the skin. Delia reached into her field jacket and found the edge of the box through the fabric. She had taken it off the cargo rack when they crossed the highway. It was in her lap now, heavy and cold, the latched lid pressing against her through the jacket material. She felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of everything it contained, the money, the gold, the journal, and underneath those things, beneath the contents that had been visible when she opened it, something she had noticed but not yet examined. She had noticed it when she picked the box up from the hearth in a hurry, a quality of the floor of the box when her fingers ran under the bottom edge to get purchase, a slight looseness, a give that steel doesn't normally have, as if the floor of the box was not the actual floor. She thought about it now, while the highway ran past and Rue pressed warm against her side, and the driver drank his coffee, and the storm moved and moved outside the windows. When they pulled into the truck stop, A big one lit up amber and white in the darkness. Fuel islands and a diner and a row of rigs parked for the night along the back fence. The driver pulled into a regular space and let the engine idle. "Thank you," Delia said. He nodded. "There's a phone inside, and the diner's open." They went inside. It was warm in the particular excessive way of commercial spaces heated for drivers coming in from the cold, warm enough to feel almost shocking after hours in the mountain weather. Fluorescent light and the smell of coffee and fried food and diesel tracked in on boots. Rue sat in a booth and Delia set the box on the seat beside her and went to the counter and asked to use the phone. She called the only number she knew by heart that wasn't her own, which was the emergency line for the Park Service Wildlife Division, the contact she used for field permits and area access. The dispatcher there knew her name, and when Delia told him she needed to report an armed confrontation with a private security operative on public adjacent land and request law enforcement contact, he did not argue. He patched her through to the county sheriff's non-emergency line, and Delia had exactly enough presence of mind remaining to remember what the letter had said. "Do not trust anyone with a badge in this county." She thanked the dispatcher and hung up. She stood at the counter for a moment, then she went back to the booth and sat down across from Rue. "We're not calling local law enforcement," she said. Rue had the box on the table in front of her. Her hands were flat on either side of it, not touching it, just present. She looked up when her sister sat down. "The letter. Yes, 55 years ago, and we're still using the same instructions." Elias was thorough. Rue looked at the box. "You noticed the bottom?" Delia looked at her. "When did you notice it?" "When you were reading the letter. I was sitting with nothing to do." She moved her thumbs to the lower edge of the box where the interior floor met the side walls. "It's not the real floor. There's a gap." Delia unlatched the lid. She removed the money and stacked the bundles on the booth seat. She removed the gold bars and set them on the seat beside the money. She removed the journal. The interior of the box was now empty, or appeared empty. The floor of it, dark steel, slightly recessed from the walls on all four sides. She pressed down on the center of the floor with both thumbs. It flexed. Not much, a millimeter or two, the tiny deflection of a thin plate under pressure. But it was not the flex of solid steel. It was the flex of something with a gap beneath it. She ran her thumbnail around the perimeter until she found the seam, then worked the tip of the pry bar under the edge. The false floor came up with a sound like an intake of breath, a short, soft exhalation of air from a sealed space that had been closed for more than half a century. Beneath it, in a space perhaps a quarter-inch deep, protected by the combined layers of the false floor above and the steel box below, a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, sandwiched between two pieces of oilskin and tied at the fold with a ribbon of cotton that had gone brown with age but held. Delia lifted it carefully. The oilskin had done its job 55 years in a steel box in a chimney, and the paper inside was intact, dry, the ink unfaded. She unfolded it on the table. It was a legal document. The paper stock was heavier than correspondence paper, the kind used for formal instruments, and the typeface was the formal old serif of a county clerk's office typewriter, slightly uneven from the mechanical keys. At the top, centered and capitalized, "Warranty Deed." Below it, the formal language of property transfer, county state description of property acreage, 340 acres, Bitterroot Valley, Montana. The legal description in the long, precise notation of survey coordinates and boundary markers that left no ambiguity about what land was being described. Grantor, the estate of Harlan Elias Calloway. Grantee, Beatrice Ann Calloway, sole heir. The date, March 14th, 1961. At the bottom, 2 signatures. The county clerk, a notary stamp, and the seal of Bitterroot County pressed into the paper with enough force to still be legible 6 decades later. This was the original deed, not a copy. The actual document recorded, sealed and legally unimpeachable, the instrument that had been superseded in the county's records by Raymond Colton's forged foreclosure filing, which had redirected the land into Colton family ownership by the mid-1960s. This piece of paper was the thing that predated and superseded everything Colton had fabricated. 340 acres of Bitterroot Valley. Currently, as Delia well knew from a week of driving those roads, the location of the primary administrative campus and mill operation of Colton Timber and Mining. She sat looking at it. Rue leaned over and read it. She read it twice the way she read everything carefully and completely. Then she sat back. "That's why they never stopped looking," she said. It was not wonder in her voice. It was comprehension, the particular tone of a 13-year-old who has understood something that adults have been managing around for decades. The journal is evidence of crimes, but this, she gestured at the deed. This isn't evidence of anything. This is just the deed. This is just the land. The original deed recorded and notarized predating the foreclosure. Delia looked at it. A valid legal instrument, which would make everything built on that land since the 1960s sitting on a foundation that doesn't belong to the Colton family. The implications sat on the table between them like the paper itself. The journal could put Garrett Colton in a courtroom. The deed could take everything else away. Delia folded the deed back into its oilskin and set it with the journal. She put everything back in the box and latched it. She thought about what came next, working through it the way she worked through logistics in the field, sequentially starting with the immediate problem and moving outward. She needed to call the FBI, not local law enforcement, not state police whose funding and political relationship with the Colton family's decades of influence she could not evaluate with any confidence. The FBI, federal jurisdiction, the field office in Seattle, which was what the letter had said and which was far enough outside the gravitational pull of Bitterroot County to be safe. She went back to the counterphone. She found the number through the operator, told the agent who answered that she had physical documentation of multiple counts of land fraud, political corruption, and the obstruction of justice spanning several decades, and that the primary subject was a current gubernatorial candidate in Montana. The agent did not dismiss her. He asked 4 questions, quick and professional. He asked her name. He asked where she was. He asked whether she had the documentation in her physical possession, and he asked whether she was in immediate danger. She answered all 4. He told her to stay where she was, that a field agent would call the truck stop number within the hour, that she should not make any additional calls about the subject and should not allow anyone access to the documentation until federal agents arrived. She went back to the booth. Rue had ordered 2 plates of eggs and toast and 2 large coffees without being asked, using the remains of the cash in Delia's jacket pocket, and they were sitting on the table when she sat down. They ate. They did not talk much. The diner was warm and the food was real, and the fluorescent light overhead was aggressively mundane. and Delia was grateful for all three in a way she had never been grateful for anything ordinary before. Rue ate her eggs methodically, one half of the toast the other half. She refilled her coffee from the carafe the server had left. She looked at the box sitting on the seat beside her. He never made it out, she said. Not a question, a conclusion she'd been working towards since the station. Elias. The letter said if she's reading it, he didn't make it to Spokane, and the box was still in the chimney. 55 years. She turned her mug in her hands. So he went out into the storm, and he didn't make it, and Grandma Beatrice never got the letter and never knew why he didn't come. Delia said nothing. There was nothing to add. She waited for him, Rue said. Or she didn't wait. She didn't know what happened, so she couldn't have kept waiting forever. But she never knew. Rue stopped. She just had no idea what became of him. Outside the diner windows, the blizzard was still going. The highway was mostly invisible, the amber lights of the fuel islands making spheres of illuminated snow in the darkness. The rigs in the back lot were already white on their roofs and cabs. It was the same storm that had been building since the afternoon, the same front that had killed their truck and sent them into the mountains on foot, the same storm that Elias Pendleton had walked out into one December night 55 years ago and not come back from. Delia reached into her jacket and took out the envelope. She had been careful with it. She had folded it the same way she'd found it and kept it against her body through everything: the fight, the escape, the snowmobile descent, the truck cab, and the truck stop. It was slightly crumpled at one corner, and there was a smear of chimney soot across the back flap, but the paper was intact, and the letter inside was intact, and the ink was intact. She had read it once in the firelight in the cold station above the canyon. She had read it as information, as context, as evidence, as the specific content of a document that explained the box and its contents and the name on the outside of the envelope. She read it again now at a table in a truck stop diner on Interstate 90 with hot coffee and warm light and her sister beside her. It was different this time. The first reading had been functional, a person absorbing facts in a crisis situation. This reading was something else. She read the opening again, the cold, the dogs, the specific way he described thinking of Beatrice as a warmth against the cold. She read the description of the deed and the theft and the documentation in the journal. She read the instructions about the FBI and the warning about local badges. She read the last paragraph. I am so cold, Beatrice, but I think of you and I am warm. Forever yours. She set the letter down on the table. The fluorescent light hummed above her. Somewhere in the back of the diner, a radio was playing something she couldn't quite make out. The coffee in her mug had gone from hot to warm. Rue was sitting very quietly beside her, reading the letter over her shoulder without asking permission, which was the kind of thing a 13-year-old who had never been given false comfort did. He had been in that station. He had been cold and afraid and alone with dogs somewhere in the distance, and he had sat by a fire and written this letter and hidden it for a woman who would never find it. He had walked out of that station into a December blizzard, and he had not reached the highway. He had never made it to Spokane. He had never reached Beatrice Calloway, who had been waiting somewhere, not knowing why he had not come, not knowing whether he was dead or simply gone in the way that some people go without explanation, without closure, without a last letter to press against their chest. Delia's eyes went blurry. She looked at the window at the storm outside, and the feeling she had been managing since the hearthstone, since the moment she read the name Calloway on that envelope and understood what it meant, came up through her chest and behind her eyes, and she could not stop it and did not try. She cried quietly, not dramatically, just the release of pressure the way cold things crack when they finally warm, not violently, but inevitably, along lines that were always there. She kept her face turned toward the window. The tears hit the back of her hand on the table. Rue's hand found hers, small fingers, warm from the coffee mug, locking around her palm the same way they had locked around it on the mist-dark mountainside, on the ledge above the ravine in every moment when the math was bad and the options were narrowing and the only constant was each other. Delia turned her hand over and held her sister's hand. Outside, the storm kept moving. The highway ran west towards Seattle, straight and real and open. The FBI agent who called back was named Carver. His voice was professional and unhurried, the kind of voice that had heard a great many things over a great many years and had learned to receive information without broadcasting a reaction to it. He asked Delia to describe the contents of the box in specific terms. She described them. He asked her to describe the journal, the format, the handwriting, the nature of the entries. She described that too. He asked her to read him the name on the deed. She read it. There was a pause on the line, not a long one, 2, maybe 3 seconds. But in that pause, she could feel something shift, the small but perceptible change in weight that a conversation takes on when it moves from a category of things that might be real to a category of things that are definitely real. "Miss Calloway," Carver said, "I need you to secure that documentation and not leave that location until our people reach you. Can you do that?" "Yes. We'll have 2 agents there within 3 hours. Don't show the box to anyone. Don't describe its contents to anyone at that location. If anyone approaches you and identifies themselves as law enforcement, ask for federal credentials specifically, and do not hand anything over until you've confirmed with me directly." He gave her his direct number. She wrote it on a napkin with a pen borrowed from the server. "Are you and your sister safe?" "We're safe." "Good. Stay warm. Stay put." She hung up and went back to the booth. Rue had pushed the plates to one side and was sitting with the journal open on the table in front of her, not reading it. The handwriting was too small and cramped for easy reading in diner light, but looking at it, at the pages turned to about a third of the way through, at the columns of figures and names and dates that filled each page in a hand that was meticulous and small and consistent. "He kept records," Rue said. "Colton. He kept perfect records of everything he did. Raymond Colton." Delia slid back into the booth. "He was a deputy sheriff. He thought no one would ever look at his safe. And when they did look, he couldn't go after them openly because that would mean explaining what was in the safe." Rue turned a page carefully. "So he just chased Elias into the mountains and waited for the storm to handle it." The way she said it was without drama, pure comprehension. A 13-year-old who had been managing the arithmetic of hard situations since she was 7 years old, sitting in a truck stop booth at midnight in a blizzard, understanding exactly how the world worked and declining to pretend otherwise. Delia drank her coffee. She refilled it from the carafe. She looked at the box on the seat beside Rue, the latch lid, the pitted steel. 3 hours was a long time and a short time depending on how you measured it. She had been awake for 22 hours, most of them spent in conditions that had burned through her reserves faster than sleep deprivation alone would account for. She was bone-tired in a way that was physical and something beyond physical, the accumulated weight of the cold and the fear and the running, and now the stillness, the abrupt removal of the thing she'd been running from. Her body did not know yet what to do with the absence of immediate danger. It was still braced. Rue fell asleep against her shoulder approximately 40 minutes after they sat back down. She went the way she always went, quickly, completely, without transition, the way children sleep when they finally allow themselves to. One moment she was sitting upright with her coffee mug in both hands, and the next she had tipped sideways, and her head was on Delia's shoulder, and she was gone. Delia sat very still so as not to wake her. She looked at the window, at the storm outside still going, the amber lights of the fuel islands making their patient spheres of illuminated snow against the dark. She thought about Elias Pendleton walking out of the ranger station into a night like this one. She thought about the ledge on the basalt cliff face, the 18 inches of ice-covered rock that she had crossed with Rue behind her, and she thought about what it would mean to cross something like that alone in a blizzard with dogs somewhere behind you in the dark. She thought about Beatrice Calloway, a woman who had been 20-some years old in December of 1968, who had been waiting in Spokane for a man who had promised to come for her, who had a plan, who had said Canada like a word that contained a whole future, and who had not come, who had sent no word left, no message, simply ceased to arrive. And Beatrice had waited for how long Delia didn't know, long enough that the waiting had become its own kind of life, long enough that she had at some point made a decision about how to continue without him. Her mother had said, "She disappeared before I was old enough to know her face." Margaret Calloway, born 1970 in Spokane, Washington. If Beatrice had been in her mid-20s in 1968, she had been in her late 20s when Margaret was born. She had been present for the first years of her daughter's life, not all of it, not most of it, but some, long enough for Colton's people to find her perhaps, long enough to decide that disappearing was the only way to keep her daughter safe from a man who had already killed once to protect his interests. And if that was true, then Beatrice had not abandoned Margaret. She had removed herself from Margaret's proximity, had created distance that looked like absence, that read as abandonment from the outside, that left a daughter growing up with a blankness where her mother's face should have been, not because she had chosen to go, but because staying had become dangerous. Delia was aware that she was constructing this, that it was the version of events she wanted to be true, the one that made the story bearable, and that the real version might be simpler and harder. People left for bad reasons as often as for good ones. She knew that. She had known it since she was 16. But the letter was real. The dead drop in the chimney was real. The specific operational quality of Elias's warning, "Do not trust anyone with a badge in this county," was not the warning of a man who was paranoid. It was the warning of a man who had assessed the situation clearly and found it genuinely threatening. And if Beatrice had eventually received some version of that information, even without the letter, even just from Elias's failure to arrive and her own knowledge of what Raymond Colton was capable of, then disappearing made sense. She had been protecting Margaret the only way she could. The two FBI agents arrived at 2:40 in the morning. They were young, younger than Delia had expected. One was perhaps 30, the other a few years older, and they came in without drama in plain clothes and found her by the description Carver had given them. They showed credentials, federal, not local. She checked the format against the standard she knew from her film work, where she had spent enough time around genuine law enforcement consultants to have a baseline for what the real thing looked like. They sat across from her in the booth. Rue slept on. The older agent opened the box. He went through the contents methodically and without comment, turning each bundle of notes, examining each gold bar, opening the journal to several pages, and reading without expression. When he got to the deed, he read it twice the way Rue had read everything, carefully and completely. He looked at Delia. "The deed is in your grandmother's name." "Yes." "You're her granddaughter. My mother was her daughter. My mother passed when I was 16. She said it the way she always said it, simply, without editorializing, because the fact was what it was, and dressing it in different language didn't change its weight. There are no other direct heirs that I know of." The agent looked at the deed for a moment longer. Then he put it back in the box with the care of someone who understood what they were handling. "We're going to need to take this with us," he said. "It'll be documented and receipted before we leave this table. You'll have copies of the receipt and a direct contact at the field office. The journal and the deed will go to our financial crimes and land fraud division. The currency and bullion will be held as evidence." He paused. "This is going to take time. I want to be clear about that. The legal process around the deed and the property claim will take considerably longer than the criminal case." "I understand." "The criminal case," he glanced at his partner, then back at Delia. "The material in this journal is consistent with what our office has been building toward for approximately 2 years. The shell company structures that fund Garrett Colton's campaign have been a subject of investigation. This documentation," he stopped himself, "back to professional neutrality. This is significant." He did not tell her what significant meant in operational terms. She didn't ask. She had given them what she found. What they did with it was their work, not hers. They documented the contents on a standard receipt form, one copy for her, one for the case file. They were methodical and thorough, and they treated the process with the seriousness it deserved. When they were done, the younger agent relatched the box and set it on the seat beside him. He looked at Rue, still asleep, against Delia's shoulder. "Is there somewhere you can stay tonight in the area? We'll find something. There's a motel 2 miles east on the highway. Tell them the agency is covering the room." He slid a card across the table. "Call that number if anyone contacts you. Anyone law enforcement press, anyone claiming to represent the Colton family or their legal team. Call that number first." She took the card. They left. Delia sat for a moment in the now empty booth, the space where the box had been, on the seat across from her, now simply empty vinyl. She had been carrying it, or holding it, or aware of its specific weight for hours, and its absence was strange. Not relief exactly, but adjustment, the slight recalibration of a body that has been braced against something and is now releasing the brace. She woke Rue by touching her shoulder once gently. Rue sat up. She looked at the empty seat. She looked at Delia. "Okay," she said. They got a room at the motel 2 miles east. It was a clean room, warm, with 2 beds and a window that looked out at the highway and the ongoing storm. Rue was asleep again before her coat hit the floor. Delia sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, the room humming with the heater, and then she lay down fully clothed and was gone in less than a minute. She slept without dreaming, which was the best kind of sleep she knew. They stayed 2 more days in the area while the formal process began. Interviews at the field office in Missoula, documentation of the circumstances, a recorded statement about the encounter with Wade Briggs that was taken by a federal agent and a county deputy who had been brought in under oversight. She learned from the agent handling her statement that Briggs had been located at a hospital in Missoula the previous morning, his knee requiring surgical intervention, and that he was in federal custody pending charges that were being assembled in coordination with the Garrett Colton investigation. She learned on the second day that Garrett Colton had been informed of the federal investigation's expansion and had retained legal counsel. She learned from a brief item in the Missoula paper that she read on her phone while Rue slept late that Colton had suspended his gubernatorial campaign pending resolution of unspecified legal matters. She read the item twice. Then she put her phone down and looked at the ceiling of the motel room and thought about Elias Pendleton sitting on a hearthstone 55 years ago, writing a letter by firelight. He had known exactly what the journal contained. He had understood exactly what it would mean if it reached the right hands. He had been 20-some years old running scared in a blizzard, and he had understood the power of what he was carrying with perfect clarity. He had just never gotten to see it used. On the third day, she packed up what little they had settled the motel bill and drove west in a rental car toward Spokane. She had not told the FBI about Beatrice. She had told them about the name on the envelope. It was in her statement, factually, but she had not disclosed what she'd pieced together about her grandmother's current location because she did not yet have a location to disclose, and because whatever conversation was going to happen between her and Beatrice Calloway was not in the first instance a conversation for federal agents to be present for. She had been thinking about it during the 2 days in Missoula, turning it over during the long interview sessions and the quiet hours in the motel room while Rue read. She had the name. She had the general information that her mother had provided. Beatrice had been in Spokane before she disappeared, had been born there, had family there, had been waiting there for Elias. But people who disappear deliberately and successfully do not disappear to the first place anyone would look for them. They change names, they move, they build new lives in new configurations that no longer resemble the original. She had her phone, and she had the drive to Spokane, and she had Rue, who was 13 years old and significantly better than her at finding things on the internet. Rue started looking outside of Missoula with the phone propped on the rental car's center console and her feet up on the dash. She searched Beatrice Calloway first. Nothing current. A few genealogical references, a mention in a county property record from 1967, nothing after 1972, which was consistent with someone who had removed themselves from the visible record around that time. She searched Beatrice Hartwell, which was the name that came to her because it was adjacent, the kind of name a person in a specific era chose when they needed a new name that felt enough like the real one to answer to naturally. A slight lateral step, different enough to be different, similar enough in rhythm and register to feel like yourself. 3 results, 2 in California, 1 in Spokane. Rue clicked the Spokane one. It was nothing dramatic, a listing in a building directory, the kind generated automatically by local service registries when a resident signs up for utilities or library services or a building's contact system. Name, address, unit number, and below the address, a single line that had been added to the listing at some point, the kind of addition that a person makes manually that requires a specific action and specific intention. Contact note, urgent notification requested if information received regarding Elias Harrison Pendleton. Delia's hands were steady on the wheel. She looked at the line for as long as she could without losing the road, then looked back at the highway. She had left a marker. After 55 years in a world that had changed, Beyond recognition from the one she'd lived in when she was 20-some years old, Beatrice Hartwell had attached a contact note to her directory listing, a digital breadcrumb in a system she probably barely understood, added perhaps by a grandchild of the building manager or a librarian or whoever helped elderly residents navigate the online systems that had replaced the physical ones. She had found a way to say, if you know his name, I want to know. She had been waiting, not passively, not with resignation, with intention. Delia did not say anything. Rue did not say anything. They drove through the morning light, the storm finally broken and gone overnight, the sky above the highway, a pale clear blue that made everything below it look newly made. They reached Spokane in the early afternoon. The building was on a residential street in a quiet neighborhood on the south side of the city, a 4-story brick structure from the 1970s, maintained but not new, with a small lobby visible through the glass front door and a panel of buzzers beside it. The kind of building where people lived for a long time. The kind of building where you knew your neighbors by name and the mail carrier by face. Delia parked across the street. She sat in the car for a moment, looking at the building. In the back seat, Rue was quiet. She had been quiet for the last hour of the drive, which was unusual for her. Not withdrawn, not anxious, simply present in the specific way she was present when something important was happening, and she understood that it was not her moment to speak. She was good at that, better than most adults Delia knew. The envelope was in the inside pocket of Delia's jacket. She had kept it there since the station, through everything that had followed, against her chest, which was where important things lived when you had no better place for them. She got out of the car. They crossed the street together and went through the lobby door. There was a directory board on the wall, white letters on a black felt background. She found it quickly. Hartwell B204. She pressed the buzzer. Static. A pause. Then a voice thin with age but clear, the particular clarity of a person whose mind has remained sharper than their body. Who is it? Delia had been thinking about how to answer this question for the last 3 hours and had not arrived at a version that was both accurate and appropriate to deliver over an intercom. She settled for what was most essential. My name is Delia Calloway. I have something for you. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she began to wonder if the intercom had cut out. Then the buzzer sounded and the lobby door unlocked. They went up to the second floor. The hallway was clean and carpeted, slightly worn in the center from years of foot traffic, with overhead lighting that was soft in the way of old buildings. The numbers on the doors ran in order, and 204 was at the end of the hall on the right. Delia knocked. She heard movement inside, slow movement, deliberate, someone who moved carefully, who had learned to be careful on their feet, who had reached the age where the body requires negotiation. A pause at the door, which she imagined was a pause to look through the peephole to consider what she saw. The door opened. The woman standing in the doorway was small. She had been taller once. You could see the structural evidence of it in the line of her shoulders, the length of her frame, the way she held her neck. But age had shortened her as it shortens, everyone eventually pressing the years into the spine. Her hair was white and kept in a way that suggested she still considered it worth keeping. Her eyes were pale gray-blue, sharp and assessing, the eyes of someone who had spent decades watching for things, who had learned to read situations quickly and without sentiment. She was wearing a cardigan the color of sage, and she was gripping the edge of the door with one hand. Her knuckles were enlarged with age, the skin thin and spotted, but the grip itself was steady. She looked at Delia. Something moved across her face. Not recognition exactly. She had never seen Delia before, but a proximity to recognition, the way a face sometimes triggers the sense of a face you know through the resemblance to someone else. She looked at Rue, then back at Delia. Delia reached into her jacket and took out the envelope. She held it with both hands, and she held it toward Beatrice Hartwell, whose real name was Beatrice Calloway, who had been 26 years old in December of 1968, who had been waiting in Spokane for a man who had written her a letter in a burning station above a frozen canyon and then walked out into the worst storm of the decade and not come back. Beatrice looked at the envelope. She made a sound, small and involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when something hits them before their cognition has caught up, when the body recognizes something faster than the mind can process it. Her free hand came up and pressed flat against her sternum, against the sage-colored cardigan, and she stood very still. The ink on the front of the envelope had survived 55 years in an asbestos-wrapped steel box in a chimney in the Bitterroot Mountains. It was clear and legible and unmistakable, and it was his handwriting, which she would have known if she had been asleep, which she would have known in the dark, which she would have known if 55 years had become 150. For Beatrice Calloway. She took the envelope from Delia's hands. She held it in both of hers with the same care Delia had held it, with the same instinctive understanding of fragility. She looked at the wax seal on the back. Delia had not resealed it. The original wax was broken from when she'd opened it in the station, and there was no pretending otherwise. Beatrice touched the edge of the broken seal with her thumbnail, tracing the remnant of the impression. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. The precision of the distinction seemed important to her. "Come inside," she said. The apartment was small and immaculate, full of the particular arrangements of a person who has lived alone for a long time and has organized the space around their own habits with complete freedom. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves, on the windowsill, on the small kitchen table that served clearly as a reading station as much as a dining surface. A chair by the window that faced south, angled toward the light with the precision of long use. On the windowsill, a row of small plants in terracotta pots, still green in November, tended with regular care. On the wall beside the front door, a single photograph, black and white, taken with an amateur's camera, slightly crooked, slightly overexposed, but clear enough. Two people in a field, grass high around them, summer light. The woman was young and laughing at something outside the frame. The man beside her had his face turned slightly toward the camera, not quite looking at it, caught in the half moment before the shot was composed, and his expression was the expression of someone looking at the person they love when they think no one is watching. Delia recognized the quality of the moment. She had spent enough years capturing animals in unguarded moments to know what it looked like. The difference between a subject that knows it's being observed and one that doesn't. He had not known in that moment, or he had not cared. Beatrice did not look at the photograph as she led them inside. She had looked at it so many times that she no longer needed to. She sat in the chair by the window. She did not turn it toward them. She simply sat in her habitual place, in the habitual light, with the envelope in her lap, and they sat on the small sofa across from her. The room was very quiet. She opened the envelope. She slid out the sheets of paper, 3 of them, and unfolded them with the slow care of someone who understands that some things do not survive carelessness and some things do not get second chances. Her eyes moved to the top of the first page. December 4th, 1968. She did not read quickly. She read the way someone reads when they have been waiting 55 years for what the words say, which is to say, with their whole body, with their whole attention, with nothing held in reserve. The room was quiet enough that Delia could hear the faint sound of the building's heating system, the distant sound of the street outside, the slight creak of Beatrice's chair as she shifted her weight. Rue sat beside her on the sofa and did not move and did not speak. Beatrice turned the first page. She read the second. She turned that page and read the third. At the last line, her hand stilled. She remained like that for a moment, both hands holding the letter flat in her lap, her eyes at the end of the last line. The pale winter light came through the south-facing window and fell across the paper and across her hands, and across the sage-colored cardigan, and across a face that had been carrying something for 55 years and had just in this moment, in this room, been allowed to set it down. She lifted the letter from her lap and pressed it against her chest. Not dramatically, not performatively, simply pressed it there against the cardigan, against the sternum, with the flat of both hands, the gesture of someone putting something where it belongs. She closed her eyes. Delia did not speak. This was not a moment for speaking. When Beatrice opened her eyes again, they were wet, and she permitted that now the tears moving down the channels that age had prepared in her face, quiet and unhurried. She did not wipe them. She looked at Delia. "Your name," she said, "Calloway. My mother was Margaret Calloway. She was born in Spokane in 1970. Beatrice nodded, small and exact. "I named her for my mother. I had to leave her with—" She stopped. She looked at the window for a moment. She was 2 years old. "I had to. Do you understand? I had to." The last sentence was not addressed to Delia, but to something older, something she had been arguing with in quiet rooms for 5 decades. He knew my name. He knew where I was living after Elias didn't come. She stopped again. After I understood what that meant, that he wasn't coming, I knew what I had to do. "She didn't know," Delia said. "My mother. She didn't know why." "No." Beatrice looked at her hands. "No, she wouldn't have. There was no safe way to explain it, no safe way to make contact. I tried once when Margaret was older. I hired a lawyer in a city I'd never been to write a letter from a return address. That wasn't mine. I don't know if it arrived. I never received anything back." She paused. "When is she?" The present tense. The hope in it and the fragility of the hope were both visible. Delia said it simply. "She passed when I was 16. A car accident. It was 11 years ago." Beatrice received this the way she seemed to receive all difficult information, with a stillness that was not absence of feeling, but the opposite, a stillness that was made entirely of feeling held carefully in place. "Tell me about her," she said. So Delia told her. She told her about Margaret Calloway, who had been a librarian in Missoula, who had loved bad weather and good coffee, and argued about books the way some people argue about sports, who had been terrible at cooking and excellent at growing things, who had kept a windowsill full of tomato plants every summer and talked to them as though they were listening, who had laughed too loud for small spaces and apologized for it without stopping, who had driven too fast on empty roads and named every animal she fed more than twice, who had been fiercely, practically, entirely devoted to her 2 daughters without being sentimental about it in the way of people who have grown up without the luxury of sentimentality, who had never stopped wondering about her mother. Rue spoke at some point. Delia hadn't planned it. and Rue hadn't announced it. She simply began to speak quietly and precisely, adding the details Delia's account had moved past, the way Margaret had read aloud to both of them on Sunday mornings, the specific cookies she made at Christmas, the same recipe every year that neither Delia nor Rue could successfully replicate. The sound of her voice when she was telling a story she found genuinely funny. Beatrice listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions to redirect or correct. She listened with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who understands they are being given something that cannot be replicated or extended once the moment ends, and who intends to receive every part of it. When they had finished, the light in the room had shifted. The winter afternoon was going early, the sun already falling behind the buildings to the west, the quality of light in the south window moving from direct to reflected. Beatrice looked at Rue for a long time. "You're 13, she said. "Yes, you look like him." She said it without preamble, without softening. "The shape of your eyes, he had that." She looked at Delia. "You look like Margaret." She had known Margaret's face for only 2 years. She had been carrying it for 53. "There's something else," Delia said. She told her about the deed. She told her about the false floor of the box, about the oilskin-wrapped document, about the warranty deed dated March 1961 in the name of Harlan Elias Calloway, transferring 340 acres of Bitterroot Valley to Beatrice Ann Calloway as sole heir. She told her that the deed was currently in federal custody as part of an evidence package, that it would be examined by the Land Fraud Division, that the process would take time, but that the document itself was legally valid and predated everything that had been built on top of its erasure. She told her about Garrett Colton, about the suspended campaign, about Wade Briggs in a hospital in Missoula. Beatrice listened to all of this too. When Delia finished, Beatrice looked at the window, at the gone afternoon light, the sky going pale and cold and clear above the roofline. "My father worked that land for 30 years, she said. It was not a statement of outrage. It was simple, factual, the statement of someone who has known a fact for a long time and is confirming it to themselves. He put everything he had into it. After he passed, I had nothing. I thought I had nothing." She paused. Elias knew. And he tried to. She stopped. She pressed the letter once more against her chest briefly and lowered it to her lap. "He went to get justice for my father's land, and he died trying to bring it back to me." Delia said nothing. "The land itself," Beatrice said. "I don't." She shook her head slightly. "I'm 83 years old. I don't need 340 acres of Montana. I don't need whatever it's worth or whatever use it can be made to serve." She looked at Delia with those pale, sharp eyes. "But you do. You and this girl." Rue straightened slightly on the sofa. "You're Margaret's daughters," Beatrice said. "You are the heirs of the Calloway name. That land was your great-grandfather's. It should have passed to your grandmother, and from her to your mother, and from your mother to you." She was precise about this, moving through the inheritance line with the clarity of someone who had lived with the injustice of its interruption for decades. That is the correct order of things, and the correct order was broken, and now perhaps it can be repaired. She looked at Rue specifically. "You are 30. "Yes," Rue said. "You will be older." Rue considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said again. Beatrice looked at them both for a moment. Then she did something Delia had not expected. She reached out and she took Rue's hand in both of hers, and she held it the way someone holds something they thought was permanently lost and have found unexpectedly still intact. She held it with care and with the precise weight of a woman who understood the difference between the things that could be replaced and the things that could not. Rue did not pull away. She sat very still and let herself be held with the particular stillness she had, the stillness that was not passivity, but acceptance, the ability to receive something without deflecting it. Delia watched her sister's face. There it was, the thing that was underneath the practicality, underneath the composure, underneath the 13-year-old version of resilience that Rue had been building since she was old enough to understand that resilience was required, a small loosening, the kind that happens when something you did not know you were missing finds you in a room you did not expect to be in. She had grown up without grandparents. Both of them had. There had been no one on their mother's side because their mother's side had been, as far as anyone knew, entirely absent. And Delia had managed this for Rue the same way she managed everything practically without editorializing, providing what she could provide, and not drawing attention to the gaps. The gap, as it turned out, was sitting in a chair by a south-facing window in Spokane, 83 years old, with white hair and sharp eyes, and a letter pressed against her chest, like something she had been waiting her entire life to hold. Delia looked at the window, at the pale, clear winter sky above the roofline. The kind of sky that comes after a storm has finally moved through and taken everything turbulent with it, leaving the air clean and cold and without obstruction. The storm in the mountains was over. The road that had been invisible last night was visible now, and the highway ran west and east, and the city ran in every direction, and the world was large and accessible in the way it only is when you have been very close to losing access to it entirely. She thought about Elias Pendleton on a hearthstone by a dying fire, writing in the dark about warmth, about a 26-year-old woman in Spokane who had waited and waited, and at some point had understood she could not keep waiting, in the same way who had made the terrible decision of love and self-preservation and had spent the rest of her life building a small, quiet life under a different name with a contact note attached to a directory listing because she refused to fully close the door. She thought about her mother, about Margaret Calloway, who had never known why and who had carried the not knowing with the same practical silence with which she had carried everything difficult, and who had raised 2 daughters alone and well and without complaint. She thought about the box in the chimney and the arch and the ledge and the 18 inches of ice-covered rock and the way Rue's hand had been on her wrist in the storm, steady and certain, a fixed point when everything else was moving. She reached over and put her hand on her sister's back between the shoulder blades, the way she had when Rue was small and needed grounding, a flat palm, a steady pressure, the physical version of I am here. Rue glanced at her, small look, quick, the look they had been exchanging their whole lives, the compressed communication of 2 people who have been each other's entire family for long enough that whole sentences live in a glance. Delia nodded once. Rue turned back to Beatrice. Beatrice was still holding her hand. She was looking at Rue's face with an expression that was ancient and specific, the expression of someone who has been given very late, something they had long since stopped expecting. Not gratitude exactly, deeper than gratitude, the particular quality of receiving that belongs to people who have had to learn to survive the absence of what they most needed and who are now unexpectedly in the presence of it. Outside, the afternoon light was almost gone. The street lights were coming on along the block one after another, amber and steady in the clear, cold air. Through the south window, the sky had gone from pale blue to the deep, transparent indigo of early winter evening, and the first stars were visible above the roofline, faint at the margin of visibility, brightening as the sky darkened around them. The heater hummed, the building settled, the street outside made its quiet sounds. 3 women in a room, 3 generations in a chain that had been broken and was not in this moment broken. The letter was on Beatrice's lap, returned at last to the hands it had been written for 55 years late, and exactly been on time.